Okay, so for this class, we were talking about political culture. Basically, what types of values are most compatible for a democratic system of government. And to that extent, I've picked out two writers who I think speak to this topic. Randolph Bourne, who wrote the essay Transnational America, and G.K. Chesterton, who wrote the book What I Saw in America. And they kind of both build on a lot of the themes that we talked about last class. So does the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville, who I think is both a big influence on Bourne and Chesterton, as well as a big influence on Sheldon Wolin also. In fact, Wolin wrote a book on Tocqueville, who sees him as a very sort of important theorist in the idea of participatory democracy. So why is Tocqueville an important thinker? Who is he? Basically, he was a French intellectual who went to the United States in the 1830s and sort of wrote about his experiences there, sort of wrote about what he observed there, which later became known as the book Democracy in America, which is easily one of the most important texts ever written about American politics, maybe the most important book ever written about American politics. So what does Tocqueville talk about? He highlights a lot of the tensions that he sees in democratic government in the United States. One of the things he emphasizes the most is this idea of equality of conditions. Basically, Tocqueville observed the importance of inequality in democratic government, which we already talked about. Basically, you can't really have a democratic government without a notion of equality, without a strong, grounded sense of equality among the citizens. But he also noted that equality itself tended to kind of undermine democratic government in many ways. So the notion of equality was much more prevalent in the United States than it was in Europe. Of course, his main frame of reference being France, and he that's another important clue to understanding his thinking. He wants to understand basically why democracy succeeded in the United States, but basically failed, at least at that point, in France. And to that extent, he places a great emphasis on again culture, what people often refer to as social norms or mores, habits of the mind, basically, or habits of the heart, as it's sometimes known as well. Um, Basically, what equality does is it promotes a sense of individualism among people, which tends to undermine democratic government. So even though democracy depends on the idea of equality, it also creates the very conditions which can undermine that at the same time. The way in which that works basically is that because the citizens all believe that they are equal, um, they believe that any one of them can sort of rise to the very top. Whereas in more traditional societies, this notion of sort of knowing your place, in the social pecking order was much more pronounced. So people tended, if you were a peasant, if you were of the lower class, you basically, expected that you were going to be in the lower class for your whole life. And most people, though not all, of course, tended to, accept that view. In the United States, according to Tocqueville, because individuals believe that, or because citizens of the United States believe that they are all equal to one another, any one of them feels that they can sort of rise to the very top. So that sense of equality among people also promotes a kind of basically a selfish attitude, an attitude that I'm going to focus on myself, I'm going to get ahead no matter what the cost. But of course, what that attitude does, though, of course, it kind of undermines the cooperative natures of democracy, the communal aspects of democracy, which Tocqueville and, of course, many other people believe were very um, important, of course. So it's interesting to note that, right? Essential contrast or tension. How equality can also, while again, equality is important and necessary for democratic government, it can also undermine at the same time. Specifically by again, promoting the sense of of individualism among people. Another term commonly associated with Tocqueville is this idea of the tyranny of the majority. So Tocqueville expressed great concern about the potential for the majority group to oppress smaller groups or individual people within the society. This is often called the tyranny of the majority, though it was not a term that he actually used himself. It's, a common enough thing that you see terms get associated with people, and then you find that they never actually use that terminology, that specific, terminology themselves. Um, and this is, in many ways, maybe his most important concept, or maybe what he's most known for, because this term can be implied in various different contexts, right? I mean, um, sociologists love, Tocqueville, because you can see the tyranny of the majority play out in almost any kind of social context, right? Any social environment where you see, sort of a dominant in group, sort of, oppressing or dominating um, the smaller group, the out group. That's basically, an idea of the tyranny. Could be an example of the tyranny of the majority. So you can see, you can see it in the famous examples of high school cliques and things like that. The popular kids, picking on the unpopular kids. You can see it, in the workplace. You can see it, at the political level here. You can see it at the political level of majority people, um, passing laws which might exclude other people or might not be sensitive to the needs of other people, or in many ways again just sort of this dominant um, culture that gets imposed upon other people, often in an informal way, right? This idea of sort of excluding people that don't belong, not necessarily through law or through any sort of explicit means, but through this kind of social um, pressure that's exerted upon people. This is, in many instances at least where Tocqueville really sort of shines forth as a thinker, and like I said, probably one of the examples where he's most well known. And I think especially when we get to the Bourne essay later, we'll see this idea of the tyranny of the majority quite clearly. So real quick, just to run through some of his other ideas. I mean, what basically uh, protects people against the tyranny of the majority. He basically, again, argues for the democratic institutions that we kind of talked a little bit about last class, the kind of democratic institutions that Sheldon Wolin emphasizes, the idea of, local self government, the idea of these kind of voluntary, groups and associations that people join. These are very important, he says, to sort of counteract the effects of the tyranny of the majority. First of all, it allows even smaller groups of people to sort of organize and kind of protect themselves in various ways. It also basically allows people to sort of, again, learn the habits of democracy, of cooperation, of collective decision making, all the things which people normally probably take for granted in the functioning of an actual democracy. So these are all things that he emphasizes a lot. He noticed that at this point in time, there was a very sort of vibrant network, to use a more modern expression, of these kinds of associations in American life that they would see, at the local level, especially. One of the things that people focus on now when they are referencing Tocqueville is to point, of course, to the decline of this kind of associational life. People don't really join associations. People don't really, participate in groups anymore. Certainly not in face to face fashion. Some people would argue that this kind of digital activism and people getting involved in cyberspace and things like that can be somewhat of a substitute for it. But I think there's good reason to kind of question that. That you can't really replace that sort of face to face encounters among people. If for no other reason than as we know, people certainly take advantage of the anonymity of the internet and things like that to be especially mean to people. Right? Let's call it what it is. People act in ways that they obviously would not act if they had to deal with people on a more face to face basis. So this kind of, again, civic associations, this kind of, communal life was very, active, was very vibrant at the time in which Tocqueville is writing, but is something which has kind of, declined significantly since then, and declined in relatively recent times too. It pretty much lasted for a long period of time, probably well into the 20th century, for the most part. Although, you also find people for a long time that have been kind of making these complaints. Also, like I mentioned, John Dewey a little bit last class. Some of the most important examples of these kinds of associations that people form. Well, one of the most important, obviously, was religion. Uh, the church, and in many cases, um, the church formed the foundation of communal life for people, not just as a means of worship, but again, it played an important sort of social function in society as well, especially again at the local level. But then you have groups based on ethnic heritage. You have people that form groups based upon their occupation. Political parties have even at a time served as an example of that, and various other types of community organizations as well. So Tocqueville sees this as an important sort of counterbalance against the tyranny of the majority, um, but the decline of which is one thing that people point out as one of the factors sort of eroding away at the foundations of democratic participation. I'll run through the rest of this pretty quickly because I want to get into the other essays. But you do have, again, local self uh, governance is an important factor in this as well. The fact that you don't just have some distant, remote government making all the important choices and decisions. You have local town, you know, meetings and city councils and things like that, and more communal organization to political life is something else. Of course, Tocqueville emphasizes a lot. Again, the decentralization of power. Religion again plays an important role. Tocqueville certainly stresses the importance of this. Not necessarily for promoting a particular religious worldview, but seeing the importance of the kind of the as I've already pointed out, the kind of sociological function that religion plays in life. Education, again, another theme that matches up with what Sheldon Wolin talks about as well. The importance of a kind of civic education for people, not just focusing on technical knowledge and quantitative skills and things like that, but educating people in the liberal arts, the humanities, things like that, things which they believed were important for again democratic um, participation as well. And again, another thing which you can certainly point to and see the relative decline of that in modern day society as well. So Tocqueville is not just a cheerleader for American democracy. He gives you a fairly impartial account, I guess you could say, of both the sort of the strengths and weaknesses of it, where he sees that the American democracy is strong. What are the tendencies that kind of undermine it, and so forth. And he also tends to be very um, prophetic in a lot of ways. He actually predicts in the early 19th century that both the United States and Russia would become future world powers, which of course they later did, though neither of them could really be said to be that at the time in which he was writing. He does obviously, when we're talking about equality in the United States, you have to, of course, acknowledge the fact that the sphere of citizenship was quite narrow at that time. Certainly, Tocqueville is aware of that and writes a lot about the issue of slavery in the United States as well. He also talks about gender issues to a certain extent, but here he tends to where he often has a very strong, sharp uh, critique of slavery in the United States, his views on gender relations are not particularly as good, and actually doesn't seem to think that there's that much of a problem with it. Actually, seems to think that the women hold a lot of power in the domestic sphere. That may or may not be true to a certain extent, but certainly that's not a substitute for any lack of political power, which certainly women did not have back then, not having the right to vote. So keep in mind, I mean, Democracy in America is a quite long um, book. It's 2 volumes long, about what 700 pages, something like that. So this is my very condensed version of that. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about briefly before getting into Bourne and Chesterton is another book, very much sort of written in the spirit of Tocqueville, called The Idea of Fraternity in America, by a professor who since passed, Wilson Carey McWilliams. Now, this book is highly influenced uh, uh, by Tocqueville. Almost every chapter in the book begins with a quote from Tocqueville. McWilliams himself was a student of Sheldon Wolin, so it's not much of a surprise that there'd be a certain thematic consistency here, which hopefully what will help us in our class as well as we sort of focus on these common themes, which, as I've said, will sort of take us through the rest of the semester. But McWilliams's work is also very much sort of influenced by this idea as well. So he picks up on this idea of fraternity. So if you go back to the French Revolution, uh, the sort of key, slogans, the sort of key ideas of the early leaders of the French Revolution were liberty, equality, and fraternity. And McWilliams, pokes at the fact that the idea, while we talk a lot about liberty and equality in the United States, we don't really talk about the idea of fraternity that much, which literally means brotherhood, but basically means a sense of solidarity among the citizens, basically, or friendship between the citizens. So McWilliams argues that the so-called liberal tradition in the United States, which animated the framers of the Constitution, once again sort of undermines the notion of participatory democracy. And that this was somewhat of an intentional thing. Again, another common element, another shared idea with Sheldon Wolin as well, who also basically argues that the way in which the constitutional system was set up was meant to, undermine the notion of participatory uh, democracy. That it self-consciously was to take power away from the majority of people as a whole and sort of give more power to the minority um, property owners. And he argues that this sort of original foundation to the American political system, as it says here, undermines local community, meaningful citizenship, and diminishes the role of collective action in public life. He also argues that it is based upon a psychologically, simplistic notion that ignores the fact that people need relationships, that people sort of need these kinds of, personal relationships, these communal relationships with other people. So McWilliams's work shows some kind of, psychological sophistication to that extent that he realizes that the people from a psychological point of view need, human interaction, need, meaningful human relationships with other people, something which he argues becomes increasingly hard to find in American life. And that the lack of that sort of feeds into the frustration and anxiety and anger, really, that people face. And I mean, it's not that hard to find examples of that in contemporary American life as well. I don't think you have to look very hard to find, the deep seated, frustration and resentment that many Americans feel. So McWilliams, however, speaks of what he calls an alternative tradition in American life. So this sort of goes beyond the sort of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and people like that, and draws on historical and philosophical traditions that prioritize relationships of interdependence, communal bonds, and collective responsibility over impersonal contractual arrangements. Cites the famous passage from the Bible, am I my brother's keeper, right? Meaning that the sense that you have to take care of your fellow person. I mean, this is literally from the story of Cain and Abel, which Cain says to God basically after killing his brother, meaning that why do I have to take care of this guy? Who is he to me? Well, he's your brother. Of course, you're supposed to take care of him. But sort of extending this idea to not just your literal familial relationships, but a sense of sort of collective concern and empathy for other people as well. So McWilliams locates this a lot in religion, in Greek philosophy, and basically sort of the pre-modern, sort of ancient uh, traditions of political philosophy. And which he also argues, focuses on the need for, again, as it says here, a more participatory, egalitarian society where individuals are connected not just through individual rights, but through shared commitments to the welfare of others, a genuine concern for other people. And again, note once again, the focus on a strong, participatory component to this as well. People taking a direct role in the affairs of governance, not just taking a passive role and delegating all power basically to, a political class of representatives who are more or less removed from, the direct lives of people. Now, this is another quite long book as well. So, of course, I can only, summarize it in, a very basic way. He does locate certain places where this alternative tradition tends to shine through more. In other words, he's arguing this is also a component of American political culture, but it tends to be much more suppressed and kind of under the surface, if you will. And I think you could also argue as time goes on, it's increasingly sort of becoming endangered or suppressed even more. But he does find this, for example, in sort of the best aspects of the Puritans, of the anti-federalists who opposed even the framing of the Constitution, in great American writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Mark Twain. He sees this, exemplified in the different experiences of immigrants coming to the United States, who oftentimes are, sort of forced to sort of fall back upon the group, to fall back upon, the collective a little bit more than the just, pursuing this kind of, very self-insulated idea of of in of individualism. And finally, he finds it, particularly prevalent in African American political thought as well. Maybe best exemplified by Du Bois, James Baldwin, and Ralph Ellison. The latter two being, of course, great American writers, but of course you can find it elsewhere. So again, it's there, but it's kind of like under the surface, to a large extent. And as time goes on, it seems as if the more sort of liberal notion of self-interest and individualism tends to becoming more and more and more of the dominant, you know, um, tendency. McWilliams was often fond of the statement, voting is just a period at the end of a long sentence, meaning that voting is kind of, in many ways, the least consequential thing that you can do as a citizen. Certainly, the notion of being a more active citizen, requires much more than just doing that. Even if just being, again, educated about politics plays a significant role. It sounds like a very passive thing to do, but when you think of the time investment that you have to make in it, it's actually a very significant thing that people can do, and unfortunately something that people tend to fall short on in many ways. Another important insight that McWilliams has, and I think this will also have some strong relevance to what we're going to be talking about, is the notion of how, in the absence of a real community, in absence of, again, sort of genuinely fulfilling those psychosocial needs that people have, the people have a tendency to fall back on various forms of basically fake communities. I think this is a very, again, a very important insight that he has. That people kind of then, when they can't find the real thing, they kind of settle for a hollow substitute of it. But that hollow substitute obviously is lacking also. So he identifies various forms of these kinds of fake communities that exist. One which he points to a lot, and which he sees, particularly dominant within many liberal thinkers, is this idea of universal brotherhood. This kind of very ambiguous notion, oh, that we're all brothers and sisters, let's all, get along and things like that, which he says, of course, is fake. I mean, how can you really, be that connected to or concerned with people who you've never met, who you have no face-to-face interaction with? Again, the idea of actual real bonds between people, real face-to-face relations between people, is of critical importance. And oftentimes he finds this idea of universal brotherhood is often um, counterposed as the goal of political action. That the idea that liberal thinkers will say, yes, yes, we believe in the brotherhood of people. That's what we're sort of working towards. So it sort of sets up fraternity as kind of like the end goal of politics, the end goal of, again, selfish individualism and things like that. That somehow doing that will somehow lead to people, forming bonds between each other, which even at face value doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But that's one idea. So he kind of very strongly, goes against this idea of universal, universal brotherhood, the idea that you're supposed to have this deep, connection for people that you've never met before. He also, of course, points out the sort of overuse and kind of inauthentic use of terms like community and family and things like that. Again, plenty of examples of that, right? We see people all the time talking about, communities of people that have never met each other, that have no real relationship to each other at all. In the workplace, particularly notorious examples of sort of, using the term, family to describe the relationship between employer and employee, which I mean most people should see as being obviously false. Then he also points to very negative and uh, destructive versions of community as well. The military, for example. Yes, people fighting, against a common enemy, people in actual situations of combat are going to develop a very close bond among each other. But as he points out, once that common threat goes away, once you're no longer fighting a war, the bonds that bring those people together tend to fade away. And besides that, he looks at things like like gangs, street gangs can provide that sense of community as well. But these are all forms of community which are basically brought together through violence. Basically, I mean through at least the threat of violence, or even sort of collectively inflicting violence upon other other people. He even points to university fraternities as an example of that. Obviously, not as violent as the other two examples, but he sees again another example of um, with the hazing rituals and things like that, a kind of a version of community which he regards as kind of a destructive version, one which is sort of based upon exclusion, and also in many cases based upon some notion of violence as well. So I think that insight into the sort of the fake forms of community that people oftentimes seek out as basically a replacement for the real thing, I think is a very interesting point that he brings up. Now, some people, so like I said, McWilliams has passed away. His daughter now, Susan McWilliams, has sort of more or less, carried on, the legacy of this, and she's an academic as well. She brings out the fact, and I'm sure McWilliams was aware of it himself, but obviously some people would take issue of the sort of very sort of gendered language of fraternity, right? I mean, it literally means um, a brotherhood. So if you were to sort of replace the term fraternity, what would you replace it with? Well, again, some people suggest the term community, but that brings up the problem that, again, the word community is already sort of drastically overused anyway. Some people propose the idea of friendship as a substitute, which she seems to gravitate towards to a certain extent. So we're talking about the idea that politics then is supposed to promote friendship between people. Well, that's a fairly novel idea, I suppose. If you think of it as a standard for politics in this country, I mean, think how far short we fall of that, right? If politics is meant to promote a sense of friendship among the citizens, I mean, where do you see that at all? I mean, certainly you do see it among people. I'm not saying people don't have friends, but the idea that it's supposed to promote friendship among citizens, not just among a close group of people. Obviously, our contemporary society falls very short of that. And it's an interesting idea because if you look at contemporary society, it's not hard to find the reactions people have against that kind of coldness, that kind of impersonal nature of uh, contemporary society. I mean, look at our culture. Look how many movies, books, TV shows, music deals with the idea of alienation, something which I've kind of broached upon last class as well. It permeates almost everything. And particularly the stuff that gets held up as being, for great critical acclaim, and what people say is, brilliant stuff. I mean, all those things place, alienation as one of the, if not the, dominant theme there. So there certainly seems to be some recognition of that fact that we live in a, a very way, in many ways, a very kind of cold uh, society. The people are kind of, mean to each other to a lot of extent. Not directly so, but treat each other in a very, like I said, very kind of cold way, a very kind of impersonal way. Um, and to a large extent, that plays a role in sort of undermining the notion of participatory democracy, which they argue is so important, even among groups that do participate. I mean, I've had some experience dealing with groups like this, groups that are involved in protest and activism and things like that. You would think that the people involved in these things would be very sort of, friendly and warm and things like that, at least to other people in the movement. But oftentimes, no. And I think that's a problem as well. I kind of mentioned that, last class a little bit too, when you're talking about, some people object to the tactics of some of the protest that's been going on. I think you also have to keep in mind to some extent that these are people who are probably not that well versed in the idea of participatory democracy. Some of them might just literally be doing this for the first time and are sort of sort of overcoming the obstacles that have already been sort of put in front of them to participate more, including the sort of lack of friendship for a for lack of a better term among people. Um, and I think that's an important thing to point out. I would also add to that of course participatory uh, democracy is in many ways a kind of messy thing. I mean it's not a clean sanitized activity among people, right? That's why they call it grassroots. You are getting sort of down and dirty to a certain extent, so you have to allow for that to a certain extent as well. But again, I think that's an important thing. I mean, none of this really, in all honesty, touches upon the economic aspects of society. How the economic demands of capitalism undermine these things as well. So you could argue maybe, if you want to take somewhat of a critical view of things, that they're only looking at this somewhat at a superficial level. But certainly it relates to it. I mean, certainly, the economic relationships that capitalism engenders, not just between employer and employees, but between other employees as well, between other members of the working class as well, obviously makes this idea of friendship very, you know, difficult among people. Interestingly enough, that was one of the things that Marx pointed upon as why he attributed such importance to the proletariat, is that he believed that the close working conditions of workers, especially in an industrial setting, would kind of, develop these close personal ties among people. So you could look at it that way as well. All right, so let's now start to get into more of the essays. We'll start with Bourne's essay, Transnational America. First of all, just to lay out some sort of groundwork. I mean, what do these terms nation and nationalism mean? People throw them around a lot. Obviously, it's factors into the title of Bourne's article. What are people basically talking about? So, interestingly enough, the word nation is etymologically related to the Latin word natal, from natalis, meaning birth, or related to birth. So, people who are in a nation with each other, who belong to the same nation, are supposed to have sort of a common birth, not literally, of course, but they have some sort of shared characteristic, you would say. Both words trace their origin to the Latin root natio, which is derived from the verb nasci, meaning to be born. Nation originally referred to a group of people who are related by birth, ancestry, or origin, essentially a community of people born into the same lineage or shared um, heritage. Over time, the term evolved to describe a political or cultural entity, often tied to shared language, traditions, and governance. So the idea of again, it basically refers to a kind of cultural characteristic. It could be based upon language, sharing a common language. It doesn't have to be, but oftentimes it refers to sharing some kind of values or sharing some kinds of culture. Eric Hobsbawm was an important historian who wrote about this, mostly about nationalism in the European context, wrote about how the development of a kind of folk culture, or what we would today refer to as a kind of popular culture, was a necessary characteristic of the development of nationalism. People sharing in some kind of collective culture. But again, the idea is a kind of shared identity that the people have with each other. Anyway, in political science, a nation state is a political entity where a nation, a group with, again, a group with a shared identity aligns with a state. We talked about the state a little bit last class, a defined territory and government. Basically, a political entity that claims um, ownership essentially over a territory, or the ability to basically, as the sociologist Max Weber would say, exert force over a certain territory, coercive force over a certain territorial area. It is a sovereign state where the majority shares a common language, culture, ethnicity, history, or sense of belonging. So, uh, examples of that could be, a nation state like France or Japan. These are both uh, territories. There is a political unit which sort of controls this territory, but it also corresponds with a national identity as well. Common language, culture, ethnicity, or history. And in both cases, I think you would say a fairly strong cultural sense as well, to the point that it oftentimes is very exclusive. Oftentimes groups who are not part of the nation have a very hard time sort of, making their way through um, the nation state that is France or Japan. Now, nationalism, the movement to sort of form nations, to create political independence for different nations of people, basically emerges as a political force after the revolutions of 1848. What Hobsbawm calls the springtime of peoples. France basically is considered to be the first example, in modern day terms at least, of a national movement. The French Revolution in many ways was a national movement. This idea of people, having a shared sense of identity as one people who shared a common language, a common culture, and things like that. Of course, that goes further back. That would be then 1780, 89. But it sort of emerges on a wider scale, basically, after 1848. Um, and I think that also the connection between nationalism and the French Revolution is important as well, because it suggests at least one of the functions that nationalism plays, which has been basically at some points has been a revolutionary movement. But nationalism can also be a very sort of conservative movement as well. So that's an interesting thing. That could be sort of both, and even at different points in time. I mean, a nationalist movement can go from being a revolutionary movement to being a conservative movement. Now, major examples of this would be the unification of Italy and Germany in the late 19th century. Again, um, um, independence movements that you saw in various nations at that time: Poland, Hungary, Ireland, Greece. These were people who were trying to proclaim their freedom basically from colonial or imperial occupation. Uh, you have other examples of it as well: Balkan nationalism, Serbia, of course, being a key role in that. The idea of a kind of pan-Slavic movement, one nation for all Slavic peoples, which kind of took shape in the state of Yugoslavia. Although, as we could see, it was a state that was somewhat uh, tenuous, you might say, although it did kind of last for a long time as well. But then the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s provoked very intense ethnic conflict between people, and you can see other examples of it as well. Other examples of nationalist movements as well, like in Romania, Bulgaria, and other examples besides that also. Um, like I said, it can function as both. It can be both at different points in time, a revolutionary movement opposing imperial domination, but in many cases, it could be a conservative movement, aiming to unify fragmented states to sort of, increase the power of one dominant group over another, or in many cases to sort of act as a way to sort of, conceal the idea of class struggle and class conflict, which plays a major role in societies as well. So it's a way of sort of, erasing the conflict between capitalist and proletariat, for example. So that's more of the conservative role the nationalism plays. I mean, obviously, I don't want to get too bogged down talking about, the European experience. I'm just giving a few examples there. Um, in the United States, I think you see examples of both. So nationalism in the United States was both a revolutionary movement in declaring its independence from Great Britain. Although I think at the time, it's also fair to point out that probably at least up until the Civil War, most people probably identified more with the state that they lived in rather than the nation as a whole. But obviously, some sense of Americans being a distinct people, certainly not just British colonial subject, was obviously an important aspect of that. Uh, but since then, you could argue that nationalism in the United States is much more of a conservative movement. It's a way of, again, sort of concealing conflict between warring economic classes, and also, as we're about to get into, also a way of sort of imposing a dominant culture upon immigrant groups. Obviously, something which is very topical now. As far as socialist movements goes, and the relation of Marxists to national movements is kind of a complex history. I don't want to get into it too much, but just briefly, I mean, Marx tended to support certain nationalist movements at some points, like Poland and Ireland, and oppose others, like the Pan-Slavic movement, which he saw was being used to further the ambitions of Tsarist um, Russia. In the 20th century, Marxist theorists like Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg would also have disputes over the idea of nationalism, and to what extent Marxists should support nationalism as well. Now, as is written in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, it's quite clear that they're pretty much against nationalism as a good in and of itself. Workers, they say, have no country. The famous phrase that comes out of this is "workers of the world unite." There's a very strong international component to the early socialist movement in the 19th century. The idea that, again, the common ties that workers have are supposed to transcend national boundaries is an important thing. Although at the same time, many people would say that, well, when push came to shove, many workers were incapable of sort of really seeing beyond their national boundaries. And you particularly saw this during World War One as well, where workers in their countries tended to side with their national governments, against workers in other countries like France and Germany, for example. So keep that in mind. Later revolutionary movements in what used to be called the Third World had a strong nationalist component to them as well, whether it's in China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc. To the extent that some people would argue that nationalism was really more important in these revolutions than socialism or Marxism. The Marxism was sort of seen as a convenient way to promote nationalism, to promote, anti-imperialist struggles in these countries. So there's a few, things to keep in mind. But, we're going to move on basically to talking about Bourne's essay now. So Bourne's, the title of his essay is Transnational America. So meaning, again, basically going beyond the idea of nationalism. So is the United States, properly speaking, a nation state? Not really, right? It's not just one people. It's never really been seen as just one people, despite attempts to make that a reality. It is much more of a multinational state. So the term transnational never really caught on, but I mean the term multinational, or since there's a strong cultural element to this, multiculturalism are much more sort of widely used terms. But that's essentially what Bourne is talking about here. And since there's a strong cultural component to this, Bourne stresses that a lot. And he stresses, especially the idea that different ethnic groups should be allowed to preserve their own cultural uh, traditions rather than being washed away in a kind of bland, mainstream American culture, which he refers to as the tasteless, colorless fluid of humanity. Now, this is written in 1916, but I would argue this holds up remarkably well in the current day period, especially with all the debates going on about immigration and things like that. Chesterton, who sort of also tackles this same idea from a slightly different point of view, argues that these principles, the principles of equality and freedom, are the political philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, which he also refers to as the creed of America, sort of like the core values of America. A creed basically is referring to the kind of a religious statement, a sort of core, values that you have to accept to basically be part of the religion. So he's saying that these are sort of core values that you have to basically accept to be part of America, which means again, tolerance for differences and this sort of this notion that every group should be allowed to live life as they please, should be allowed to practice their own kind of culture and things of that nature. So here's a quote from Bourne, which I'll read out. Bourne writes, to face the fact that our aliens are already strong enough to take a share in the direction of their own uh, destiny, and that the strong cultural movements represented by the foreign press, schools, and colonies our challenge to our facile attempts is not, however, to admit the failure of Americanization, it is not to fear the failure of democracy. It is rather to urge us to an investigation of what Americanism may rightly mean. It is to ask ourselves whether our ideal has been broad or narrow, whether perhaps the time has not come to assert a higher ideal than the melting pot. So interestingly, he kind of does not like this uh, metaphor of the melting pot, which people commonly use. People say this all the time, right? America's a melting pot. Basically, what he's saying is that, if you take the term literally enough, what he's saying is that the melting pot implies that people kind of lose their distinct qualities, right? They kind of melt into this fluid that is not distinguishable from each other. Rather, he's saying that people should, preserve, distinct and unique characteristics. Should, preserve th- the differences that they have, basically, rather than just all sort of, assimilating into the same culture, which he finds to be very kind of, hollow and inauthentic. And already, even at Bourne's point in time, you already have the development somewhat of American consumer culture. It would develop more so, especially in the 1920s. But I think that's a very sort of enduring theme that we still deal with now, right? This idea of this kind of hollow, sort of fake, empty American culture based on consumerism, basically, in contrast to the more sort of authentic, uh, traditional cultures that people bring with them, and especially the attempts to kind of strip people of that culture, of their authentic culture, and sort of impose this kind of, or at least by taking it away, leave them nothing else but this kind of hollow American culture. Surely we cannot be certain of our spiritual democracy when claiming to melt the nations within us to a comprehension of our free and democratic institutions. We fly into panic at the first sign of their own will and tendency. We act as if we want Americanization to take place only on our own terms and not by the consent of the governed. All our elaborate machinery of settlement and school and union, of social and political naturalization, however, will move with friction just insofar as it neglects to take into account the strong and virile insistence that America shall be what the immigrant will have a hand in making it, and not what a ruling class descendant of those British stocks, which were the first permanent immigrants, decide that America shall be made. This is the condition which confronts us and which demands a clear and general readjustment of our attitude and our ideal. So again, couldn't say it better now. And still very relevant now, like I said. So Bourne was one of the leading progressive thinkers of his day. Again, Sheldon Wolin talks about the progressive movement as sort of a high point in the idea of participatory democracy in the United States. One of the first attempts to really reestablish a basis for participatory democracy in the face of increasing industrialization, in the sort of expansion of America into a mass society, into basically dealing with all of the tendencies which undermine participatory democracy uh, today. One of the first attempts to really sort of deal with that, sort of reestablish that, and you could argue how successful they were at that. I would obviously say clearly not successful enough, but they did have some important successes and did reform some of the institutions of American life to be more um, democratic to a certain extent. Bourne also kind of stands out, and he was only really one of the only few progressive intellectuals who was also opposed to U.S. entry into World War One. Most of the progressive thinkers, despite whatever democratic credentials they may have, basically supported the U.S. entry into World War One. Something which I don't think is a decision which can really be defended now. So Bourne kind of stands out on his own for that. Bourne also died very, very, very young, only in his 30s when he died. So keep that in mind as well. In fact, he died just a couple of years after writing this. Um, he goes on to say, we're all foreign born or the descendants of foreign born. And if distinctions are to be made between us, they should rightly be on some other ground than indigenousness. The early colonists came over with motives no less colonial than the later. They did not come to be assimilated in an American melting pot. They did not come to adopt the culture of the American Indian, which of course is obviously true. The truth is that no more tenacious cultural allegiance to the mother country has been shown by any nation, by any alien nation, than by the ruling class of Anglo-Saxon descendants in these American states, basically referring to the English. English snobberies, English religion, English literary styles, English literary reverences and canons, English ethics, English superiorities have been the cultural food that we have drunk in from our mothers' breasts. So, is that still true today? Do you have a dominant English culture opposed upon people? I mean, that may not be necessarily true, but there is sort of a dominant, for lack of a better term, mainstream American culture, which again, if anything, is even less authentic than the English culture of the past, but still obviously bears some significance to it, but also crops up in various other ways. White supremacy, obviously, patriarchy, even homophobia or heteronormative identities and things like that. I mean, there are still obviously strong traces of that, but it was certainly much worse in Bourne's day, right? I mean, there were attempts to strip people of their culture, and quite successful at that. For example, I mean, many people today, many American immigrants at least, are bilingual. They speak Spanish, they speak Polish, they speak whatever language they speak, whatever language is spoken in their home country, they still retain. And American life has changed to some extent. It's a little more um, conducive to that, right? Right. Allows people to do that more. In the early 20th century, it was much harder to do that. And you can see the evidence of that in earlier immigrant groups to the United States. For example, I would say most Italian Americans do not know how to speak um, do not know how to speak do not know how to speak Italian. Sorry, excuse me. I was choking on something. Um, and they sort of pepper in words here and there, usually to describe food or something like that. But for the most part, don't know how to speak it, which I think is a regretful thing. So we've gotten a little bit better, maybe in some aspects of that, but still not so great. Maybe better than European countries do, which, from what I've read, if anything, are even more harsh in the way they treat immigrants. Um, Now, at the same time, like I said, I think we've moved a lot away from the sort of English culture of the past that the Bourne is talking about. We'd also refer to people as WASPs, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Ironically enough, I mean, if anything, probably the most enduring legacy is in the political institutions of the country. In terms of religion, like I said, Protestantism being especially the dominant trend. Do you still see that in the United States now? Well, according to the survey, I mean, I won't, in the interest of saving time, I won't go into it, but you can see that yes, while Protestantism does tend to be still the largest religious grouping within the United States, religion in general is going down, right? I mean, basically about a third of Americans now consider themselves to have no religion at all, which is kind of high, at least by American standards. The United States does generally tend to be more of a religious country than a lot of other countries, but you do see evidence of that changing as well. Chesterton, for that matter, is sort of an interesting example in that he is a Catholic uh, from from England. So he is basically, practicing a minority religion in England, and religion definitely plays a very big role in what he says. It permeates almost everything that he says. In fact, so taking a quote from him, he compares the American Constitution to the Spanish Inquisition, which at first glance you might seem kind of odd. I mean, what was the Spanish Inquisition? It was this notorious court set up in Spain in the Middle Ages to basically try mostly Jewish people who had not converted to Catholicism, or in many cases to try people who had converted to Catholicism, but were still accused of secretly practicing the Jewish faith. So it's become a very notorious institution. It lasted basically up until I believe like the 20th century. Um, so what does Chesterton write here? He says the American Constitution does resemble the Spanish Inquisition in this that it is founded on a creed. Again, America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. That creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps the only piece of practical politics that is also theoretical politics and also great literature. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice, that governments exist to give them that justice, and that their authority is, for that reason, just. It certainly does condemn anarchism, and it does also, by inference, condemn atheism, since it clearly names the Creator as the ultimate authority from whom these equal rights are derived. Nobody expects a modern political system to proceed logically in the application of such dogmas, and in the matter of God and government, it is naturally God whose claim is taken more lightly. The point is that there is a creed, if not about divine, at least about human things. So basically, again, saying that the sort of core values of American life can be found in the Declaration of Independence, which again basically consists of equality and justice. That people are treated equally, that people are given justice, which is a hard term to define, but basically means something like people sort of get what they deserve in life, I guess. And we'll cover this more next class when we do talk about the Declaration. That basically, the government has to do that, and if the government is not doing that, if not is not giving people justice, then basically you have a right to change or even abolish that government. And I wonder how many people, today would actually feel that the United States government actually comes through on its end of the bargain. That in other words, as that we accept the authority of the United States government in exchange for the United States government guaranteeing equality and justice to people. Does the U.S. government actually, come through on its end of things? I think you can make a good argument that it does not, of course. Now, again, Chesterton also talks about the idea of citizenship. So he says, now in a much vaguer, more evolutionary fashion, there is something of the same idea at the back of the great American experiment, the experiment of a democracy of diverse races, which has been compared to a melting pot. So he also uses the idea of melting pot. He doesn't seem as concerned with Bourne and taking it as in a literal fashion. But the metaphor implies the pot itself is of a certain shape and a certain substance. The melting pot must not melt. The original shape was traced on the lines of Jeffersonian democracy, and it will remain in that shape until it becomes shapeless. America invites all men to become citizens, but it implies the dogma that there is such a thing as citizenship. Only so far as its primary ideal is concerned, its exclusiveness is religious because it is not racial. So here's what Chesterton is basically saying. Unlike countries like France or Japan, which I mentioned last class, which have a very sort of strong national heritage and um, identity, the United States is not like that. The United States does not have, despite the best attempts of conservatives in this country to make this a reality, the United States does not have that strong of a national identity. It is in fact composed of many different nations. So he argues that because it does not have that strong a sense of national identity, it has to then insist on people sort of internalizing these core values, again of equality and justice, basically, in exchange for the fact that it does not have the strong, cultural identity to it. So it's, in both uh, cases, he's looking for kind of a unifying force, right? In some countries, the idea of the nationality gives people a sense of unity with each other. The United States does not have that sense of unity. So, in exchange for that, the unifying force comes through these sort of common sets, through this common internalization of values, basically. And of course, it's these values which are supposed to then be sort of, conducive to and complementary to the idea of participatory democracy as well. Although you always have to, worry about, how well these values actually being uh, preserved. So that's, I mean, more or less their argument in a nutshell. I'd also like to point out a little bit, again, of the historical context in which they're talking, because I think that's important as well. So again, I already kind of alluded to this to some extent, but um, Bourne is writing basically just before the United States gets involved in World War One. The war itself had started in 1914. This article was written in 1916. The following year, the United States would declare war and get itself involved in the war. The war would then end the following year in 1918. Now, why did the United States get involved in the war? To make the world safe for democracy, which is what was claimed at that time, and which apparently a lot of progressive thinkers bought into. I mean, you could get into that a lot. Some people would argue, of course, that had a lot more to do with the financial obligations of the United States, the idea that the Allied powers had borrowed so much money from the U.S. that there was a fear that from directly from the U.S. government, in fact, not even just from private bankers, that if the Allied powers had lost the war, the United States government would not get paid back. This is the argument of people like Michael Hudson in his book Super Imperialism, for example. Um, we don't have to get involved in that. We'll try to stay out of international affairs for the most part, and just focus on the aspects of the American government. But during this period of time, because this was an international conflict, there was again a strong crackdown on so-called hyphenated Americans at this point in time. Again, Americans who were not seen as pure Americans. So there was this attempt again to sort of impose this idea of American nationalism, which sort of comes out of nowhere, right? It's not really based on any real solid foundation, but there was this scrutiny and and skepticism of hyphenated Americans, like Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Irish Americans, et cetera, et cetera. People who were seen, especially immigrants coming into the United States, were basically seen as not real Americans. They have dual allegiances there, and especially a lot on, of course, German Americans at this point in time, because this is who World War One was being fought against, or who the war is being, fought against from the side of the Allies. Um, and again, you see this pop up time and time and time again. Especially during a time of war or any time of political crisis, there is this tendency to sort of focus on who the so-called real Americans are, and who are sort of the outsiders. And again, I think it's a pretty clear example of this concept of the tyranny of the majority being sort of applied here in this political context. I have reference to the Lenin and Trotsky here, which I'll just skip over. I mean, people have argued. I guess it's worth pointing out that one of the most ideological things you can read in any American history textbook is why the United States got involved in World War One. that it's just completely concealed as to what the real motivations were. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson, who was considered a progressive and president at this point in time, was running for re-election. There's also a very famous example of a president lying basically to people um, to get elected. So Wilson runs in 1916 on a campaign of neutrality. They're going to keep the United States out of the war, as you can see here on this campaign truck. Who keeps us out of war? Here you can see it in the next thing. This is obviously a very big part of the campaign. Now, at this point in time, secretly, Wilson had already decided among his close advisors that the United States was going to get involved in the war. So even though they're running on a campaign of keeping the U.S. out of the war, they had already basically made the decision to get the U.S. into the war, which of course it would do in the following year. People who oppose the war, as I talk about in the article I wrote, I focus a lot on this period of time and the crackdown on socialists and anarchists who were opposed to the war, blatantly violating, their freedom of speech and their right to protest in many ways, something which we see, many other examples of that as well. One of the people who were most persecuted during this period of time was Eugene Debs, who was imprisoned for speaking out against the war. Actually, really for speaking out in support of other people who were opposed to war. And was thrown in prison for it. Now, he was the leader of the Socialist Party. He had run for president numerous times. After being thrown in prison, he ran another presidential campaign in 1920, his fifth and last presidential campaign, won almost 1 million votes from a prison cell. Not bad. Like the Green Party, wishes it could get 1 million votes now. And of course, the country is much bigger now than it was back then. Now, this is a cartoon, obviously, so it kind of makes it sort of, comical. I mean, to give a little more, gravity and seriousness to it, this is his mugshot. You can see he's quite elderly man at this point in time. Was thrown in prison basically for, exercising his freedom of, speech. So that's another thing, when we talk about how we're a free society and, we tolerate all kinds of political differences and things like that. I oftentimes have a hard time, you know, believing that because I know there's a very long history of oppression, basically, of socialists and anarchists. People were very strongly to the left, especially when you call out war in this country's history, and that's really nothing new. Here are some sort of famous examples of propaganda postage you can see at this point in time. Now, the propaganda effort also to get the U.S. public to support the war was completely unprecedented at that point in time. People had never seen anything like this. This massive effort to, essentially brainwash people to support war, a war they really had no, interest or involvement, and certainly no threat to national security or anything like that. National security being a infamously overused term, also. But you can see the kind of assault on their senses, basically, which was employed to get people to join. This is obviously anti-German propaganda during this period of time. I should also point out that during this period of time, German language was banned from being used in many schools. People even went as so far as to, rename, German foods like sauerkraut, Liberty cabbage, and they called hot dogs, also known as Frankfurters, Liberty sausage, and things like that. A similar thing happened during the invasion of Iraq, where France did not agree with the United States. So did the UN Security Council, which did not, of course, stop the U.S. from going to war anyway. But people were so upset at France, they started renaming French fries, freedom fries, and French toast, freedom toast, and French kissing, freedom kissing, and all that other stuff. So these kinds of dumb things happen from time to time. Here you see different type of propaganda, sort of maybe appealing to a different emotion. Be a man and join the Navy. But you can see, the imagery here is much, softer, more, pleasing colors rather than the harsh, reds and oranges that you saw in the others. Now, somebody apparently did this for COVID, obviously. I don't know what they had in mind here. Are they mocking efforts to wear masks? Or, the very, minimal efforts at public health imposed by the United States government during this period of time? Do they think that this is? I'm assuming actually that this is probably somebody doing this in support of mask wearing, but they're completely oblivious to the fact that these propaganda posters was not like a great moment of patriotism in this country's history. This is basically an aggressive attempt again to basically brainwash people to do something that's sort of against their interest that they had no real involvement with. So completely sort of tone deaf, I think, to what's actually going on here. But I guess that speaks to the lack of historical knowledge that most people have. Now, another important consequence of this was that after World War I, the government passed very strict immigration quotas into the country. That's something else which has obviously very striking similarities to what we're talking about now. And you can see it's quite um, effective. So immigration had proceeded to a large extent from the 19th century onwards, the middle and late 19th century especially, to the point that by about 1910, according to this, had risen to about 15% of the population, about 13.5 million immigrants living in the country altogether. After the quotas are passed, you can see immigration shrinks to where it's by 1970 less than 5% of the population, only about 9.6 million immigrants in the country at that point in time. It's only in the later 1960s where these immigration quotas are not removed completely but relaxed somewhat. And you see that the flow of immigration to the country has increased since then. But by 2021, as a percent, in real numbers, of course, you can see over 46 million people, but as a percentage of the population, still relatively small overall, only about 14% of the population. So still smaller as a percentage of the population than what you saw in 1910. Now, of course, one of the groups to be targeted especially hard by immigration laws were Chinese immigrants coming into the United States. So Chinese immigrants start flowing into the United States in large numbers, basically in response to the California gold rush in 1848, 1849, on the West Coast, obviously. And also, played a very big role in building the railroads here within the United States. And this is a famous photograph here, the meeting of the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific railroads. That might be hard for you to see, but do you see any Chinese men in this picture here? And the answer, of course, is no. So while they played a very big role in building the railroads, we're not, of course, invited to the big photo op. There's none that I can tell from viewing this picture. Of course, there is, of course, ample photographic evidence show you the role that Chinese laborers played in building the railroad, which is of crucial importance. I mean, building the railroads, as anyone would tell you, is immensely important for economic reasons. It's also important for connecting the country as a whole, for really even in a sense, kind of even building a sense of national identity in the country, right? You're not going to feel any connection with people that live far off if you have no means of communication or transport. So the building of the railroads in the United States was, immensely important, both for the idea of building an American nation, or even if it is a multinational country, but building a solid, infrastructure, from coast to coast, basically, as well as, of course, mostly for developing the economy of the country as well. So how do we react to the Chinese laborers to help build the railroads? We banned them from the country. You can literally see a picture here of Uncle Sam, kicking a guy in the ass, kicking him out of the country, basically. This is actually, believe it or not, an advertisement for laundry detergent. As you can see here, the magic washer. Because, of course, as you know, one of the stereotypical images that Americans had of Chinese immigrants in the United States, or Chinese people living in the United States, was owning laundromats. So they're basically saying, you don't need the Chinese laundry anymore. Just buy our, patriotic American washer, and you'll be fine. Next to that, you can see an advertisement, proclaiming support for the Chinese Exclusion Bill, which was signed into law in 1882. So kind of going backwards a little bit, the Chinese Exclusion Bill sort of laid the framework for what would later become the much more expansive immigration quotas of the 1920s. But this act basically barred all immigration, or I should say most immigration from China for a period of 10 years. It was later extended to basically permanently, and was not removed, like I said, until after the immigration quotas were relaxed after 1965. Um, and it also so it barred future immigration from China. For Chinese immigrants already living within the United States, they were allowed to live there, but they also barred any chance to become a citizen of the United States also. So you had basically a permanent supply of low wage labor, which could continue to be exploited, but would also sort of set limits on the influx of future Chinese people into the United States. And of course, this is a long story in the United States as well. We have a long history of exploiting immigrant labor in the United States as a source of cheap labor. And of course, this was what was on the minds of many people during this period of time as well. There was a massive economic depression starting in 1873, which lasted for about 20 years, in fact. Um, this law was passed in 1882. And so one of the major objections that people had was this idea that, surprise, surprise, Chinese immigrants were stealing jobs from Americans. Where have we heard this before? Now, as far as Trump's current day immigration proposals go, um, it's predicted it's going to do massive harm to the economy, and it should not be that much of a surprise. I don't even know what people who support this idea even think is going to happen. But Trump plans to deport something around 13 million Americans, or I'm sorry, 13 million undocumented immigrants. Um, but many studies have shown, of course, that this is going to have a negative impact on the economy of the country, which, if anything, is an indication, of course, of how much, again, our capitalist system depends upon the influx of cheap, low wage labor. I mean, it's not necessarily something to be celebrated, of course, but obviously, if the system depends on that low wage labor, what do you think is going to happen when you eliminate the low wage labor? How is that going to affect the economy of the economy of the country as a whole? Here's a few more quotes from Bourne. I'm not going to really read them. I'm going to try to start wrapping things up. He does right here: if freedom means a democratic cooperation in determining the ideals and purposes and industrial and social institutions of a country, then the immigrant has not been free, and the Anglo-Saxon element is guilty of just what every dominant race is guilty of in every European country: the imposition of its own culture upon the minority peoples. He talks about the South being a very sort of stagnant part of the country, precisely because it has been much more insulated from foreign influence. This shows certainly some blindness, I think, on Bourne's part, because of course he completely discounts the role that African Americans are playing in the South in developing the culture of the country. I mean, almost. I mean, think how, what contributions African Americans have made to popular culture in this country. And we talk about nationalism in many ways as being a product of popular culture, or people call it back then folk culture. I mean, is there any aspect of American culture that African Americans have not strongly influenced? Particularly in music, we think of blues, R&B, jazz, rock music, hip hop. I mean, almost everything that you could possibly think of. So again, Bourne talks about consumerism. He says our cities are filled with these half breeds. So he's talking now about people who have sort of conformed to the pressure, right? They've sort of given into the pressure. They've sort of turned away from their own traditional culture, and try to assimilate themselves. And what you're left is just with, people who have, in a sense, almost no identity at all, no cultural identity at least. These half breeds who retain their foreign names but have lost their foreign savor. This does not mean that they have actually been changed to New Englanders or Middle Westerners. It means that letting slip from them whatever native culture they had, they have substituted for only the most rudimentary the American culture of the cheap newspaper, the movies, the popular song, the ubiquitous automobile. So again, a lot of what people would say now about consumerism in the United States. Um, and I think that even speaks a lot to immigrant groups who do come into the United States. This idea that conservatives have that immigrants are so stubborn and recalcitrant and don't want to assimilate to American culture. I mean, where do you really see any real evidence of that? Um, especially when it comes to especially when it comes to consumerism. I mean, if I have my own sort of take on it, my own twist on this argument, you almost wish that immigrants coming to this country would be a little more resistant to consumer culture in this country. In fact, most people who come into this culture, who come into this country, within a generation or so, basically adopt most aspects of consumerism, right? I mean, let's be real here. The McDonald's culture, watching TV, not reading books. I mean, that's another thing about American life. It's a very kind of intellectual culture for the most part. I mean, there are all sorts of studies and statistics to show that Americans don't read anymore and things like that. Is that a hard culture to assimilate yourself to? A culture that encourages people to just eat junk food and watch TV and not read? Of course not. Of course, it's not hard to assimilate to that culture because it appeals to every sort of lazy, selfish impulse that people have. Why would that be hard to? Like I said, if anything, you wish people would fight against it a little bit more. And this idea that American culture is so superior that most people just can't, rise up to its standard. I mean, that's another joke as well. A lot of these conservatives like to think they're like modern day, Athenians or something like that. But they're not. I mean, the most, visible notion of American culture is probably McDonald's. Again, like fast food stuff. And this is a picture here. You can see of Trump. This is not, as far as I know, this is not AI or Photoshop or anything like that. This is Trump when he was president during his first term, having McDonald's night at the White House. I mean, to me, this is a perfect, symbol of contemporary American culture and basically everything that Trump represents as well. And it's not to be totally dismissive of all aspects of American culture. There's a lot of aspects of American popular culture that I like as well. But I think people have to kind of get over themselves a little bit and stop acting like it's this, vastly, superior culture. To some extent, I think that some of the alternative cartoonists kind of speak maybe best to that. Here's a famous poster by the cartoonist Robert Crumb, Story of America. And I think it kind of, encapsulates a lot of what I've been talking about in this class. You see, the sort of gradual development, from a green meadow and forest. You see the introduction, civilization, the railroad probably built by Chinese workers, and you can see gradually how the society grows and develops. But before long, it turns into this kind of urban wasteland, which is alienating and dehumanizing and things like that. And it kind of speaks to contemporary American life and the kind of culture that like what kind of culture are we putting on people to drive a big gas guzzling car and to eat shitty food and things like that. I think it kind of this image kind of captures it to a certain extent. Here's another bizarre image. Sorry, I should have given people more of a warning from this, from Robert Williams, who sort of draws these very surrealist paintings and stuff. Here you see a guy being ground into Play-Doh or something like that, or meat or something. These guys kind of celebrate the kind of vulgar aspects of American culture, but they kind of make fun of it at the same time. This idea that's this like superior culture. Here's another, and also a sense that American culture is increasingly heading in this uh you know direction as well. Here's another painting by Williams, kind of also captures a lot of what Crumb is sort of doing in his now, sort of projecting even more into a kind of future dystopian world that you can see here. I believe the next image is also by Williams. It's actually from an album cover. A little bit of suggestive imagery here. This is actually an album cover he did for the group Boogie Down Productions, hip hop group out of the Bronx. Um, you know, Politicians looks like Lyndon Johnson over there. This weird Picasso-esque figure pointing to a clock with a mushroom cloud. There's another cartoonist I like, Spain Rodriguez, probably my favorite of these underground cartoonists. These are people who are all sort of coming around in the 1960s, kind of part of that underground culture and stuff like that, showing people fighting in the 1950s, a gang fight basically in Buffalo, which is where he grew up. Kind of shows you, different image of the 1950s. It wasn't this, pristine, sanitized culture that we like to think it was. It was, basically kids were as, fucked up back then as they are now. Here's this famous anti-hero character, Trash Man. He's kind of like sort of like a Marxist superhero. Again, sort of making fun of the fast food culture. Eat weird burger, you little pig. Here's another image. I'll kind of end on this. This is a more sort of utopian image, image of sort of the kind of multinational America that these writers have sort of been advocating for. This is an image of the Mission District in San Francisco, and again, much more sort of pleasing image, obviously harmonious image. But again, you can see elements of this kind of multinational culture. So I think it's kind of a good place to end things on. And again, so I think that kind of gives you a sense of the kind of political culture that we are talking about here, as well as the challenges of preserving this culture and the kind of dangers that it faces. Perhaps in a terminal way. I mean, I don't know if there's any real good indication to suggest that anything is going to sort of change the culture around in that way. It could be that we're just heading more and more into this kind of dystopian nightmare, unfortunately. But certainly enough, yes, you sort of have the kind of thriving participatory democracy that people would like to see. It's just not something you can just conjure out of thin air either. It does depend upon a certain values, a certain education, um, which is not easy to come by these days, unfortunately. And this is the importance of that is raised even more so when you do have people coming in from different countries, which in many cases, of course, do not have a history of participatory uh, democracy also. So if anything, even raises the stakes even more to sort of have that right kind of education, to give people that kind of experience for that. But like I said, you pretty much find that in short supply here. All right, so I'll pretty much wrap up this class, and so we'll pick up next class. We're talking about the foundations of the American government. Okay, all right, so take care, everyone.